I'm going to challenge your idea of what a battery means to you and what a battery essentially is and does in your electric vehicle, whether that's a vehicle that flies or drives. I'm going to present a little bit of information today that's going to hopefully broaden your spectrum on a few fronts. First of all, I do have an EV, but my EV flies, it doesn't drive. I've actually got quite a few. We've been operating electric aircraft in Australia since 2019. It was the first time we were able to certify an electric aircraft in Australia for use in pilot training and for recreational use and private hire. So quite a few years we've been operating and learning. We expanded the business over the past few years. We now have electric aircraft operating in Western Australia and in Melbourne. And we're now expanding in Melbourne and building a large-scale international electric pilot training facility at Latrobe Valley. So very exciting stuff. And something else I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to challenge your idea of what a battery means to you and what a battery essentially is and does in your electric vehicle, whether that's a vehicle that flies or drives. Now, this is brand new content that I wrote just this week for this show, so you'll have to bear with me while I read from the screen a little bit as I go through it. But let's get into it. So, while many of you in the audience might have a pretty good understanding of battery electric versus ICE, there is a fundamental difference which, in my experience out there in the market, is not really being realized by a lot of people. There's just the general consumer out there and the general person considering what sort of vehicle to choose. There's a lot of naivety still on what a battery does, how it operates, even a lot of naivety on what an ICE engine does and how it operates. Some of you might be very familiar with the internal combustion engine and how it's all operated and mechanically what's occurring, but a lot of people don't understand. And when you understand the difference between ICE and battery, you start seeing why battery electric can be a better idea for a lot of people. But without that understanding, people don't really know why they would want to choose one over the other, except for maybe some basic economics and maybe ease of access to petrol. And some people still feel like ease of access to petrol is easier than ease of access to recharging. So what I'm going to go over now is a little bit about the internal combustion engine, which is not what you came here to hear about, but I want to showcase a little bit of where we've come from, what the internal combustion is and how it operates, to then compare that to battery electric and have a good understanding of just what magic is going on in there. So, give you a little bit of background apart from what we've been working in aviation. I had a fortunate childhood. While not at all wealthy, my parents were very practical. They both had practical hands-on jobs. My mum was a nurse and my dad was a horticulturalist. We lived in rural areas, out of town, and I had a lot of freedoms, particularly in school holidays. I was able to explore the bush, ride bikes, climb trees, shoot arrows, and from the age of 10 onwards, service my own two-stroke motorcycle. A two-stroke motorcycle engine is as simple as a combustion engine gets. It's got very few moving parts. It's not very efficient or clean, and they wear out very quickly, which means regular rebuilds. I am quite appreciative of this time in my life where I was able to come to understand at a very fundamental level just what magic occurs inside a combustion engine cylinder. Many of you will know the internal combustion engine two-stroke, four-stroke, rotary or otherwise, draws a mixture of fuel and air on the induction stroke of the piston cycle. Sometimes extra air or fuel is forced in with forced induction for greater volumetric efficiency. This is then compressed in the compression stroke of the piston cycle. The dense mixture of compressed air and volatile combustible hydrocarbons are introduced to a well-timed spark. A spark that in this critical moment of compression and maximum volatility starts a chain reaction. This reaction separates the carbon and hydrogen from the mixture and makes new chemical bonds of carbon and oxygen, as well as hydrogen and oxygen. As this reaction causes the mixture to change from a compressed cool state to a hot gaseous state, the chemical reaction pushes the piston away as it expands, thus turning the engine, making the vehicle go forward and leaving behind a trail of exhaust gases of carbon dioxide and dihydrogen monoxide left over from the chemical reaction. Why am I telling you all this? This is an electric SUV expo. You didn't come here to learn about combustion engines. I wanted to highlight this process because for those of you who didn't know about it, there is a magic moment in there. That critical moment when the chain reaction of chemical bonds shifting and changing form releases an energy we can harness for our own purposes. There, at the quantum level, a near mystical process as old as the universe itself unfolds, electrons shifting from element to element, making new bonds and metamorphosizing into a new state of being, all in a fraction of a second. The combustion engine, beautiful in its destruction and disregard for harmony and stability. This process is, of course, unsustainable. It requires a constant input of new hydrocarbon fuel, and it leaves behind a trail of waste wherever it goes. What if us clever, clumsy apes could come up with a way to harness the energy release of a chemical reaction without the waste? Even better, what if we could come up with a way to keep the fuel and the waste and simply change it back to a usable source of energy after we were done using it? Where did my engine go? At the heart of an electric vehicle is the battery, which many people perceive as merely a storage vessel for electricity. However, this perspective overlooks the fundamental and profound role of the battery in the vehicle's operation. The battery is much more than just a storage device. It is the component, the core component, where the magic of energy conversion happens. In essence, it is the combustion chamber of an electric vehicle. Here's how. The battery stores energy in a chemical form. When we charge the battery, we're not just filling it with electricity, we're actually facilitating a chemical reaction where within the battery cells, storing energy as chemical bonds. When the vehicle operates, the stored chemical energy starts to be converted back into electrical energy. There, at the quantum level, a near mystical process as old as the universe itself unfolds, electrons shifting from element to element, making new bonds and metamorphosizing into a new state of being, all in a fraction of a second. And yes, us clumsy apes did get a little cleverer. Instead of constantly shoving more fuel in and leaving waste behind, this new chemical process doesn't change size as it unfolds, so we can contain it in a neat little package. And we managed to get clever enough to find a way to change it back almost exactly as we started, so we can repeat this process again and again with no additional input fuel and no waste in our wake. Where did my engine go? Just like the combustion engine, we harness this chemical process for our own purposes. The energy released is not one of changing size, but of changing electrical potential. And instead of pushing a crank through a gearbox to turn a wheel or a propeller, we push electric forces through a matrix of opposing magnetic fields called a motor to turn a wheel or a propeller. So where then is the engine in an electric vehicle? This is your engine. This is where the critical conversion of chemical potential into usable energy occurs, electrochemical potential. An electric motor is not much more than a crank and gearbox, a critical component in your electric system, sure, but the heart, the soul of your EV is in the battery cell. When you start understanding that the battery cell is the fuel engine that holds you in your EV, you start treating it differently. You are more careful not to thrash it. You are more careful to make sure it is well serviced and has the conditions it needs to operate well. It starts to change your design outlook for charge hardware and battery cooling infrastructure. When you let go of the thought that a battery is just a storage device, you start to understand just what it needs to function correctly. and under stressful conditions. And these needs are not very different to a combustion engine. It wants to be well cooled. It wants to operate in a particular range of optimal function. It does not want to be thrashed on the discharge or on the charge cycle. A well-treated battery is a longer lasting engine. And for our operations in aviation, the longevity of the battery performance is critical to safety and successful business economics. Well, if a battery is your engine, where then did your fuel go? The battery is, of course, also your fuel. But unlike an ICE vehicle, where you need to replace the fuel every couple of days, in a battery electric vehicle, you only have to replace the fuel every couple of years, if that. And after each time you use your BEV, it merely needs to be reset with a gentle service, of which the only consumable product is electricity. The electricity is not your fuel. The battery constitution is. Electricity is merely resetting the chemical bonds in your fuel so it can be reused again and again. So I'm asking you to give this a try. Start thinking of the humble battery cell as more than a storage vessel. Start visualizing it as a mighty engine, capable of great power and potential, but also vulnerable, just like an internal combustion engine that needs careful care and handling for maximum longevity and performance. As more electric vehicles move into the aviation space, like the absolutely spectacular XPeng eVTOL, get over and check it out. That thing is very real. And we're doing a flight demonstration with that in Sydney in just a month or so. So get onto our channels and check that out. But as more of these vehicles enter the marketplace, it's critical that we teach new electric pilots and operators that the battery fuel engine needs just as much careful management and attention as the internal combustion engine. It just doesn't need as much toxic mass added and expelled in day-to-day operations. I'm not resentful of the lessons that the fossil fuel era has taught us. I grew up soaking in petrol and oil, rebuilding two-stroke motors and trying to get the lawnmower to start. Does anyone remember that? Trying to get a lawnmower to start on a cold morning? I've got a battery electric lawnmower now. It's so much better. It's quiet and easy and just goes. No mess, no smell. So I'm not resentful of this time. It taught us many lessons and given us many gifts. Many great and wonderful things have been achieved in the fossil fuel era. And one of my favorite outcomes of this era is powered flight. But now we've progressed through our powered flight adolescence, and as a species we are starting to learn and find new and better ways to harness and deploy energy for our own purposes. I have faith that we've come to understand the errors we made in our technological youth and are now collectively working to set things right and on a renewable path to sustain the beautiful natural world we all enjoy and to have a legacy, to leave a legacy that we can be proud of. I'd like to finish this little anecdotal part of the presentation with an old Greek proverb which says, "Society grows great when people invest effort in seeding trees that will long outlive them, comfortable in the knowledge that others will live on to enjoy the shade long after those that seeded them are gone." Now, before we get into a couple of questions, I'm just going to touch on a couple of cool metrics about what's happening with electric aviation globally and in Australia. Give you a little bit of an idea of the market potential and market demand and a little bit about how far we've come already. So the aviation sector is still booming. Commercial, regular, all the traditional aviation is still growing, as well as all the interesting emerging sectors. Boeing estimate that 650,000 new commercial pilots will be required between now and 2043. That's because of some emerging economies, mostly in Asia, where there are hundreds of millions of people that couldn't afford to fly 10 or 15 years ago, and now these growing economies are allowing more and more people to afford to fly, and it's driving a massive demand in the region. So that's just in legacy aviation, a demand of 650,000 new commercial pilots. But then we have this interesting emerging sector of these sorts of personal electric vehicles that are going to require pilot training as well. So there's an absolutely enormous opportunity there. Those personal electric flying vehicles and the emerging air taxis that you'll see in the media a lot are referred to commonly as the Advanced Air Mobility market, or AAM. And those estimations by firms like Deloitte and Morgan Stanley, we're looking at valuations of that sector being worth over $100 billion a year in just a decade or less. In Australia, there are already 437,000 hours of air taxi occurring every year in ICE petrol aircraft. So this is on-demand charter aircraft, not regular public transport in commercial planes, but any on-demand air transport. So helicopters, small planes, medium planes. It's a very busy and healthy industry. So air taxi is alive and well right now and has been for a very long time. And that generates revenue in Australia per year of close to $500 million. There are almost 9,000 small aircraft in Australia that operate on leaded fuel still. 2 to 6 seat aircraft typically run on avgas, which is a leaded fuel. And those things are flying over our communities, sprinkling tetraethyl lead, 1.8 grams per litre of fuel. And it's no secret anywhere in any culture that the leaded fuel is highly toxic to humans. So we got past that a long time ago on the ground. For some bizarre reason, it's still happening in the air. The average age of those 2 to 6 seat aircraft in Australia is 37.8 years old. So most of those aircraft in the next 20 years will be replaced. And we're hoping to help people replace them with electric options. The 650,000 new pilots for the commercial sector globally represents a business opportunity of $68 billion worth of pilot training. That's not including all of the new pilots required for the AAM sector and private electric flight. So there is an absolutely mega opportunity there for some operators to come in and service this market. In Australia, we have a beautiful and unique opportunity, which is that our airspace and our weather is very conducive to pilot training. So we can help service this massively growing sector in Australia and export pilot training to other regions that can't easily do pilot training in their area. This is a bit of a pipeline of the aircraft that we're flying now and in the future. Now we have the 2-seat trainer aircraft that we've operating for a few years. In the immediate future, air testing beginning this year, we have small electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. That's the type of aircraft you'll see starting to replace small helicopters with the similar range and payload capabilities of existing helicopters, just with much more safety and redundancy and much lower cost and emissions. Then we're moving into 4 and 6 seat aircraft in the imminent future. We're expecting timelines of 25 to 26. We'll start integrating the early models of those and moving into 5 and up to 15 seat aircraft. The biggest one you see on the map there on the screen is a hybrid hydrogen electric aircraft being developed here in Australia, in Brisbane. A manufacturer called Stralis. I recommend checking them out. That's a picture of one of the aircraft there flying over Fremantle in Western Australia. Absolutely beautiful way to fly. No, very little noise, no vibration, no smells. They glide beautifully. They're a very graceful aircraft, so I recommend trying the experience. And try winning it first. If you don't win one, get in and book with one of our flight training partners anyway. Now, they haven't kicked me off the stage yet, so I must still have a little bit of time for some questions. Does anybody have a question about electric aviation? There we go. We've got a mic here for you.
Do you have to change the pitch angle the same way that you do with a normal engine, or does a pitch curve work for you?
Yeah, the pitch angle of the propeller. Yeah. The first aircraft that we have operating now is a fixed pitch propeller. There's a couple of reasons why they're good and bad. In pilot training, all pilot training is started without with a fixed pitch propeller typically. It's an added complication that the early student doesn't need. They're still learning a lot of fundamentals, so it's one extra complication that you don't want in the first stage of training. And also there's an interesting thing that the electric aircraft offers. One of the reasons why we do a variable pitch on bigger aircraft is so they can go faster and higher in thinner air. Typically with electric aircraft we won't be flying as high. The biggest energy penalty in your flight mission is the climb. So we're climbing only as little as we have to, just to clear weather, to clear airspace, to have enough height and speed to be safe. But we don't really climb as high as you normally would in an ICE aircraft. So we're staying in thicker air, which means the propeller's still nice and efficient. But also, the other interesting thing, with an ICE engine, they're built to operate at a particular RPM. So they have a perfect torque and efficiency range that might be, say, 24 to 2600 RPM. Now, you want your propeller to spin and be effective at different speeds, but the engine has to stay the same speed, which is one of the main reasons the variable pitch came around. With the electric engine, it doesn't matter. The electrical power system doesn't care whether it's spinning at 800 RPM or 2600 RPM. It's just as efficient through that whole range, basically, within a couple of percent, but it's negligible. So what we can do then is design a slightly different type of propeller, which has a more aggressive pitch. It operates at a slightly lower RPM, but it can speed up in the thinner air or on warmer days where the air is softer. On cooler days, the air is denser and needs a slower RPM. And we see that in our flight ops. I'll be flying the exact same mission with the exact same payload. I often fly alone. And on a hot day, my RPM will maybe be 200 or 300 RPM higher. On a cooler day, it's lower. And on the cooler days, I do get up to maybe sometimes 5 or 7 minutes more endurance flying the exact same mission, and that's because the propeller's operating a lot more efficiently in the cooler air. So on the smaller electric aircraft, and another great advantage of a fixed pitch propeller is simplicity in maintenance, manufacture. It brings the costs down across both of those. So you'll see in aircraft like the Xpeng that are flying low, typically in thicker air, not necessarily at high altitude, in a smaller speed window, it will have a fixed pitch propeller, as will a lot of the two-seat smaller aircraft, because it's still versatile and still usable. But the longer range aircraft, the 5-seat that was up on the screen before with the twin prop, it will have a variable pitch, so it can go a little bit faster, a little bit higher altitude. We're definitely supporting fixed wing primarily. This aircraft glides 30% better than a typical ICE-powered aircraft, and that's just due to the modern sleek design, low drag, high aspect ratio of the wing, has very high lift characteristics, very low drag characteristics. So our safety profile on this is so much higher that Air Services Australia, which is who governs the airspace and coordination of aircraft in Australia, they granted us unique flight paths in Perth that they do not let ICE aircraft fly because our risk assessment profile was so much better than traditional ICE aircraft. So with the addition of most of these new aircraft, all of these new aircraft, all of our aircraft have ballistic parachutes built in, even the big ones that weigh, they're going to be close to 2 tons. They still have a ballistic parachute that can deploy at any speed up to 450 kilometers an hour. So in the event of a major catastrophic failure like collision with a Pelican, which is something that happens completely out of everybody's hands, nothing to do with the aircraft designer, might cause a forced emergency landing. If we're not able to make that forced emergency landing in a safe run-out area like a paddock or an airstrip, the parachute can be deployed and that aircraft can land safely on water or in a non-built-up area. So the risk profile of the modern aircraft, just by their design characteristics, got nothing to do with the propulsion system. They're so much less risky than a traditional aircraft. So it's just an evolution of the industry in every single way. Sorry, question?
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation today. And I love that you went through the ICE versus electric comparison in the beginning. I think most people here are absolutely supporting a cleaner and safer energy future for any mobility, whether it be in the air or on the ground. And electric is actually the way forward for sure. I think the technology is proving that. The grid is only going to get greener. We're only going to get more solar, more renewables. So the actual supply of electricity will become greener in Australia and across the world. There's a no-brainer. But I think in terms of the technology here that we're seeing advancing is the battery technology is getting better and better, lighter and lighter, more reliable and safer as well. Just on your airplane there, so you're starting off with current lithium-ion, I'm guessing, the battery technology.
Yep.
What changes have you seen over the last few years since you've been developing these aircraft with batteries and capacity and weight?
Good question. So aviation is a little bit behind the rest of the development sector, and part of the reason of that is it's not because anybody's lazy or not trying. Aviation has a lot of compliance and a lot of oversight, which is fantastic. It's very hard to get new things into the aviation sector, and that's part of what makes it so safe. Statistically, aviation is the safest way to travel because the compliance and the oversight is extreme, and it forces everybody into being very accountable and making very high quality components and products and systems and processes that supports ongoing safety of operations. So interestingly, the batteries we're using in this current aircraft, they're a manganese, cobalt, lithium-ion construction, and it's a 10-year-old design. And that's not something we can change rapidly because the manufacturers and the regulators want to see thousands and thousands of hours of data on usability and reliability. These types of batteries are the reason these cells were able to be used and deployed in an electric aircraft is because Airbus have been using the exact same cells for over a decade, and they have millions of hours of data on the performance of these batteries. They're in the Airbus aircraft. They're not used for the propulsion system. Obviously, they're used for backup and storage and as a redundancy for the navigation systems. But they've been certified in aviation and used for a long time. So the regulators were happy with this sort of background data of information to then let us use it for the core propulsion system. But then again, part of what let us move through the regulations smoothly and get these certified in Australia was because of that high glide ratio and the ballistic parachute. The bias concerns about an electric propulsion system suddenly failing, which happens far less than ICE systems suddenly failing. Those concerns were alleviated by the secondary safety systems that the aircraft has, which are higher than a typical traditional aircraft. Just something I didn't mention before, which popped into my head as you were asking the question, because I think you might have mentioned efficiency or economics. Our cost of operations and what we're able to pass on to the end user, which is pilot training. We're working mostly with high schools. The parents love these aircraft, by the way, because our safety profile is so much higher. So they're quick to get their kids in a brand new aircraft with a ballistic parachute than a 50-year-old Cessna. And we've reduced the cost of ab initio pilot training, so the early 20 to 50 hours of pilot training, by half. Like literally half the cost to the end consumer. So we're hoping to to the point of the last keynote speech, which was all about lowering the barrier. This is lowering the barrier to entry. It's not lowering the barrier to entry to electric. We're actually lowering the barrier to aviation, because the barrier to entry is very cost high. Operating the traditional aircraft is very, very expensive. Whereas these new electric aircraft, there's simpler systems, less moving parts. The service and maintenance schedule is easier and faster, less components, and it speeds up that whole expensive side of the business, so we can pass on some savings to the customer.